The dust didn't care who it settled on. It coated the righteous and the wretched with the same fine, ochre powder. It settled on the raw post she was tied to, on the frayed ropes that bit into her wrists, and on the thin cotton of a dress that had surrendered its color to the sun long ago. Her bare feet were cracked and stained with the earth of 3 counties, and her hair hung in tangled ropes, a curtain she tried to hide behind. They called her too wild. The name was spat from the mouths of men who appraised her like livestock, a bitter seed on the tongue. It was whispered by the women who gathered at the edge of the mercantile porch, their faces pinched with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was a problem, a debt left behind by a man who had gambled away everything, including the contract that bound her. Now, she was just another piece of unwanted property in a town that had too many of its own. The man trying to offload her, a bloated merchant named Silas Croft, paced in front of her. His voice was a greasy thing, slick with false bonhomie that couldn't quite cover the sharp edge of his frustration. He spoke of her strong back, her youth, but his eyes told a different story. They told of a locked room, of defiance that had cost him more than it was worth. The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward. They saw the same thing he did. Not a person, but a burden with haunted eyes. She kept her own gaze fixed on a loose board in the porch of the assayer's office across the street. She studied its grain, the way the sun bleached it gray, the dark crack that ran down its center like a frozen lightning strike. She focused on that single, meaningless detail until the world shrank to the size of that piece of wood. The voices became a dull hum, the heat a distant pressure. She had learned to make herself small, to retreat into a place inside where the ropes couldn't reach. Then a shadow fell over her small world. A new silence cut through the murmuring of the crowd, a different kind of quiet. She didn't look up, but she felt the shift. It was the way the air changes just before a storm, a sudden stillness that holds its breath. A man stood at the edge of the gathering, separate from it. He wasn't part of the jeering circle or the whispering clutch of women. He was just there, a pillar of stillness in the swirling dust. He wore a coat that had seen too many winters and not enough mending, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in a deep, unreadable shadow. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that she recognized without knowing why. He didn't look at her like she was a horse to be bought or a problem to be solved. He just looked. Silas Croft noticed him, too. His greasy voice dripped with new hope. "Ah, Elias, come for supplies? Perhaps you're in the market for some help? This one's indenture is cheap. Cost you less than a new plow." The man, Elias, didn't answer right away. His gaze moved from her to Croft, then back to her. A long moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. The dust motes danced in the bars of sunlight between them. Then, a voice, low and rough like stones grinding under a river. "I'll take her." It wasn't a question or a negotiation. It was a statement, flat and final. Croft blinked, surprised. "Well now that's good business. She's got a mean streak, mind you. They call her too wild for a reason." Elias gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't count the coins. He just poured a small, heavy pile into Croft's waiting palm. It was more than she was worth, and they both knew it. It was the price of silence, the cost of ending the spectacle. Croft's greed overcame his surprise. He pocketed the money with a fleshy slap of his thigh. "She's all yours, then. Good luck to you." He turned and walked away without a backward glance. The matter concluded. The crowd began to disperse, their small drama over. They drifted away like leaves on the wind, leaving only the two of them and the dust. Elias walked toward her. She flinched, her muscles tightening, bracing for a rough hand. But he stopped a few feet away. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his trousers. The blade clicked open, a small, sharp sound in the sudden quiet. He didn't speak. He simply knelt and, with slow, deliberate movements, sawed through the coarse ropes at her ankles. The fibers parted with a dusty sigh. Then he stood and moved behind the post to cut the ropes at her wrists. His knuckles brushed her skin, a touch so light and impersonal it was like being grazed by a leaf. The rope fell away. Her arms dropped to her sides, heavy and numb. The blood stung as it rushed back into her hands. She didn't move. She stood there, untethered but not yet free, her eyes still fixed on that cracked board across the street. Elias waited. He folded his knife and put it away. He didn't speak a word of command or comfort. He just waited for her to be ready. After a long minute, she took a hesitant step, then another. She followed him as he walked toward a tired-looking horse hitched at the far end of the street. She followed because it was the only direction offered. The journey to his homestead was a silent one. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they had left behind. He rode the horse, and she walked beside it, her bare feet finding a rhythm on the hard-packed earth. The sun beat down, a physical weight on her shoulders. The landscape was sparse and unforgiving, all cracked earth and thirsty sagebrush under a vast, empty sky. After an hour, he stopped the horse. He swung down and unhooked a canteen from the saddle. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it out, an offering. She watched him for a moment, her throat a desert. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. The metal was warm from the sun. She drank, the water tasting of rust and life. When she was done, she handed it back. Their fingers brushed. It was the first real contact between them. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He said nothing, just took the canteen and hung it back on the saddle before mounting up again. They continued on, the silence between them now holding the small, shared weight of that single gesture. His home was little more than a scar on the land. A small, weathered cabin that leaned into the wind as if tired of standing. A barn that looked even more tired. A few spindly fences enclosed a patch of stubborn, dusty land. On a low hill overlooking the cabin stood a single wooden cross, stark against the skyline. The place felt hollow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that was never coming back. He led the horse to the trough, and she stood uncertainly in the middle of the yard, a piece of driftwood washed up on a desolate shore. The wind turned mean, whipping her hair across her face and chilling her through the thin dress. Elias finished with the horse and walked to the cabin door. Creaked open, revealing a dim, Spartan interior. He went inside, leaving the door ajar. It was not an invitation, but it was not a dismissal either. After a moment of shivering in the wind, she followed. The inside was one room, clean but empty of comfort. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A stone hearth cold and black. A narrow bed in one corner, neatly made. In the other corner, a small alcove held another cot, this one bare. A thick, dark blanket was folded at its foot. He was stoking the embers in the hearth, his back to her. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his voice low. "The cot is yours. There's stew in the pot. The door doesn't lock." It was a contract laid out in 3 spare sentences. Place to sleep, food to eat, an assurance of safety. He was offering her shelter, not possession. She looked at the door, at the simple wooden latch with no keyhole. The door doesn't lock. The words echoed in the empty room. A quiet promise that was the opposite of everything she had known. She didn't answer. She walked to the cot, her feet silent on the worn floorboards. She sat down, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself small again. He got the fire going, and a small, flickering light began to push back the shadows. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. He sat in one of the chairs and began to eat, his movements slow and methodical. The other bowl sat there, steam rising from it in a soft white plume, an offering like the water. She watched him eat for a long time before her hunger finally won. She crept to the table, took the bowl, and retreated back to her cot. The stew was thick with potatoes and a little meat, and the warmth spread through her, a small anchor in the vast coldness of her life. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against pottery. When he was finished, he took his bowl to a wash basin, cleaned it and set it to dry. He didn't take hers. He left that choice to her. As dusk settled, bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the land, He picked up the dark blanket from her cot. He unfolded it and held it out to her. It was heavy, made of coarse wool, but it was clean. She took it without a word and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a shield against the growing chill of the night. He settled onto his own bed, fully clothed except for his boots, and pulled a thin quilt over himself. Within minutes, the steady rhythm of his breathing filled the small cabin. He slept the sleep of the exhausted, a man who worked from sunup to sundown and found no rest in between. She did not sleep. She sat on her cot, wrapped in the heavy blanket, and watched the firelight dance on the rough wooden walls. The house breathed around her, a slow, sleeping sound. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not behind a locked door. She was just in a room, and that simple fact was a terrifying, fragile kind of freedom. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine began to form, unspoken and unbidden. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would go out to tend the land, to mend the things that were constantly breaking under the strain of a life lived on the margins. She would wake to the silence he left behind. First, she did nothing. She sat on her cot, a ghost in his house. But the idleness was a cage of its own. One morning, she took the broom from the corner and swept the floor. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. She swept the dust from the cabin, and then she swept the porch, her small act to claim on the space. When he returned at midday, he noticed. His eyes flickered to the clean-swept floorboards, but he said nothing. He just left a piece of bread and a slice of dried meat on the table for her before going back out. She grew bolder in her silence. She found the small, neglected garden behind the cabin. Weeds choked the life out of a few hardy potato plants and some withered herbs. She began to work, her hands clumsy at first, then finding a forgotten memory of how to pull weeds, how to turn the soil. Her palms, soft from disuse, blistered and then hardened. She was stitching herself back into the world, one weed at a time. One afternoon, she walked up the low hill to the single grave. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it almost erased by the wind and rain. Sarah. She stood there for a long time, looking at the simple marker. It wasn't pity she felt, but a strange kind of kinship with the silent occupant of this lonely plot of earth. The next day, she found a stubborn, purple wildflower growing by the creek and placed it at the base of the cross. From the far pasture, Elias saw her. He stopped his work, leaning on a fence post he was mending. He watched her small figure on the hill, a slash of color against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. When he came in that evening, his silence was different, felt less empty, more thoughtful. She began to cook. Her first attempt at bread was a disaster, a small, hard rock of flour and water. She left it on the table, ashamed. When he came in, he picked it up, turned it over in his calloused hands, and broke a piece off with a crack. He chewed it thoughtfully. "A little dry," he said, his voice flat. It was the first time he had spoken to her about anything other than the most basic instructions. The sound of his voice startled her. She just stared at him. He chewed for another moment, then a ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "My Sarah's first loaf could have been used to stone a barn. This one only died in vain." A tiny, unfamiliar bubble of something rose in her chest. It wasn't laughter, not yet, but it was a cousin to it. She looked down at her hands, hiding the faint upward turn of her own lips. He ate another piece of the terrible bread before setting it down. He didn't complain about his own cooking after that. Slowly, the house began to change. It was no longer just his space that she happened to occupy. She mended the threadbare curtains with thread she found in a dusty sewing box. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. She learned the loose floorboard by the door that always threatened to trip him and watched one evening as he quietly nailed it down. One cold night, a storm blew in from the north, rattling the cabin's thin walls. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain came down in hard, angry sheets. A crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the small house, and she woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was back in a dark room, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding shut echoing in her mind. She sat bolt upright on the cot, trembling, her breath coming in short, panicked rasps. She couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. A floorboard creaked. Elias was standing by the hearth, a shadow against the dying embers. He didn't approach her. He just added a few small logs to the fire, coaxing it back to life. The flames leaped up, pushing the terrifying shadows back into the corners. He sat in one of the chairs by the fire, his back to her, and simply stayed there. He didn't speak. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just shared the small circle of light with her, a silent guardian against the storm within and without. She watched his steady presence, his broad back a bulwark against the night. Slowly, the frantic beating of her heart began to slow. The trembling subsided. She pulled the wool blanket tighter and lay back down, her eyes on the fire and the man who kept it burning. She fell asleep to the sound of the rain and the quiet assurance that she was not alone. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp, and the sun shone on a landscape that glittered with a million tiny droplets. As he was heading out the door, he paused. "I don't know your name," he said, not as a demand, but as a simple statement of fact. She looked up at him, this man who had bought her, freed her, and sheltered her. This man who ate her terrible bread and sat by the fire with her through storms. He had never laid a hand on her in anger or ownership. He had asked for nothing. She opened her mouth, but the name wouldn't come. It was a thing that belonged to another life, a life of pain and shame. It wasn't hers anymore. She just shook her head, a small, sad gesture. He nodded once, accepting her silence as he accepted everything else, with a quiet, weary grace. And he left. That evening, he came back with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table. Townsfolk were talking. "Silas Croft's been drinking, boasting. Says he's coming to collect what's his." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile peace she had built. The world she had pushed away was coming back for her. Her hands began to tremble. Elias watched her, his expression grim. "He won't take you." It was a promise, spoken in that same flat, unbreakable tone he'd used in town. He pushed the parcel toward her. "This is for you." She unwrapped it with shaking fingers. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather boots, worn but well cared for, and a simple dress of dark blue wool, the kind a farmer's wife would wear. Practical, warm. It was a uniform for the life she was living, a skin to replace the ragged one she had arrived in. "They were Sarah's," he said quietly. "They'll be too big, but they're better than nothing." She looked from the clothes to his face, and for the first time, she saw past the weariness to the deep well of sorrow in his eyes. He was not just giving her clothes. He was giving her a piece of his past, a piece of his grief. He was arming her with his wife's memory. It was the most profound gesture of trust he could have offered. The harbinger of their doom did not come as a letter. It came as 3 riders on the horizon, dark shapes growing steadily larger against the blood-orange smear of the setting sun. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Elias saw them first. He was coming in from the barn, and he stopped dead in the yard, his shoulders stiffening. She was on the porch, shaking out a rag rug, and she saw the change in him. She followed his gaze to the approaching riders, and a cold dread settled in her stomach. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and tight. For a moment she hesitated. The old instinct to hide, to make herself small, warred with a new, unfamiliar impulse. But she saw the hard line of his jaw and obeyed, retreating into the cabin. She didn't go to her cot, though. She stood by the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the sill, and watched. It was Silas Croft, just as Elias had said. He was flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking drifters with cruel, empty faces. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, their presence a violation of the quiet space Elias had carved out of the wilderness. "Elias?" Croft boomed, his voice oozing a false heartiness. Come to check on my property. Heard you were putting her to good use. His eyes roamed over the tidy yard, the mended fence, the smoke curling from the chimney. His gaze was greedy. He saw not a home, but an asset that was being improved without his permission. Elias didn't rise to the bait. He stood his ground on the porch, his body a solid, unmoving obstacle between them and the cabin door. She's not your property, Silas. I paid you. Croft laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. You paid for her labor, not her indenture. A misunderstanding. I've come to correct it. She belongs to me until her debt is served. And I say it's not served. He swung down from his horse, his bulk landing with a soft thud. Now send her out. We'll be on our way. No, Elias said. The word was quiet, but it carried across the yard with the force of a slammed door. Croft's face darkened. The flimsy mask of civility fell away. Don't be a fool, Elias. You're a broken-down sodbuster on his last leg. I'm a man of standing. The law is on my side. Now, step aside before you get hurt. One of the hired men dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of a pistol at his belt. The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy. Inside the cabin, she watched, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She saw Elias's shoulders, broad and steady. She saw the sneer on Croft's face, the casual menace of his men. She thought of the locked rooms, the ropes, the jeering crowd. She thought of the quiet safety of this cabin, the warmth of the fire, the taste of stew, the weight of the wool blanket. She looked down at her hands, no longer soft, but calloused and capable. She had a choice. She could stay here, a frightened rabbit in a hutch, and let this man fight her battle for her, or she could stand. The front door creaked open. Elias didn't turn his head, but he knew. He felt her presence behind him, a small, warm spot at his back. She stepped out onto the porch, wearing the dark blue dress and the sturdy boots. They were too big, as he had said, but she stood tall in them. In her hand, she held the heaviest cast-iron skillet from the hearth. It wasn't much of a weapon, but she held it like it was an axe. Croft's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. There you are, you little witch. Get over here. She took another step, standing beside Elias, not behind him. Her eyes, clear and cold, met Croft's. No, she said. Her voice was thin from disuse, but it was steady. It was her own. The simple act of defiance, of her standing with him, changed the air. It was no longer one man protecting a piece of property. It was two people defending their home. Croft, enraged by her insolence, took a step toward the porch. I'll drag you out of here myself. Elias moved, placing himself squarely in front of her. You'll have to come through me. The hired man drew his pistol. The metallic click was unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. That's enough, Silas. The voice came from the edge of the property line. All of them turned. An old man, their nearest neighbor Jedediah, stood there, leaning on a fence post. He was holding a long rifle, and it wasn't pointed at the sky. His wife, Martha, stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern disapproval. They must have seen the riders coming. This ain't your business, old man, one of the drifters snarled. A man defending his home is every decent folk's business, Jedediah said, his voice calm and steady as his aim. Elias is a good neighbor. You are not. I suggest you get back on your horses and ride out the way you came. Croft looked from Jedediah's rifle to Elias's unyielding stance, to the girl with the skillet and the fire in her eyes. He was a bully and a merchant, not a fighter. His authority was built on the assumption that no one would dare to challenge it. Now, two quiet homesteaders and a girl they called Too Wild had done just that. The odds had shifted. He spat on the ground, a final, impotent gesture of disgust. This isn't over, but the threat was hollow. He heaved himself back onto his horse. His men, seeing their employer's resolve crumble, holstered their weapons and mounted up as well. They rode away, their dust cloud a dirty smear against the twilight. Silence descended on the small yard, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The silence was different now. It was not empty or heavy. It was a shared space, filled with the aftermath of the storm they had weathered together. Jedediah gave a curt nod. "Elias." "Ma'am." He and Martha turned and walked back toward their own cabin, leaving them to their victory. Elias slowly lowered his arms. The tension drained out of him, leaving him looking weary to his bones. He turned to her. His eyes searched her face, looking for fear, for trauma. He found none. He found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You didn't run," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I had nowhere to run to," she answered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. This place, this broken-down cabin with this broken-down man, was the only home she had. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before it gently touched her arm, just above the skillet she still held. His touch was warm and firm, a confirmation, an acknowledgement. "Thank you," he whispered. And in that moment, under the first pale stars of evening, something shifted between them forever. They were no longer just a man and the woman he had saved. They were partners. They had stood together. They had won. The skillet felt heavy in her hand. She lowered it, the iron clinking softly against the porch boards. The fight was over. A new life was beginning. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. The small cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. They sat at the table, sharing a meal of bread and cheese, the silence comfortable and deep. The unspoken things between them had finally been said, not with words, but with shared risk and unwavering support. After they had eaten, Elias looked at her across the small wooden table, his face softened by the firelight. The winter in his eyes had begun to thaw. "I need to know what to call you," he said. It was not the same question he had asked before. This time it was a request, a plea for the final piece of the woman who had stood beside him. She looked down at her calloused hands, resting on the worn wood of the table. The name Too Wild was a brand seared onto her by men like Croft. The name she had been born with was a ghost from a life that no longer felt like hers. She had been nameless in this new life, a creature of actions and silence. But now she needed a name, one that was her own. She thought of the wildflowers she had placed on Sarah's grave, of the stubborn life they clung to in the hard soil. She thought of the way the creek flowed, quiet but persistent, cutting its own path through the rock. She looked up and met his gaze. "Lena," she said. The name felt new and clean on her tongue. It was a name for the woman she was becoming, not the girl she had been. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. A slow smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and melting the last of the ice there. "It's a good name." The giving of her name was a final, binding contract. It sealed the bond forged in the dust of the yard. A few days later, she took the ragged dress she had arrived in, the last physical remnant of her old life, and she took it to the fire pit behind the cabin. Elias stood with her. She didn't have to explain. He understood. She dropped the flimsy, dirt-stained garment into the flames. They watched together as the fire consumed it, turning the fabric of her past into smoke and ash. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He left and returned a moment later with the parcel he had brought back from his last trip to town, the one he had hidden away. He handed it to her. Inside was not another of Sarah's dresses. It was a bolt of soft, new calico cloth, printed with small, hopeful blue flowers. It was a promise of a future, a thing for her to make into whatever shape she chose. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one of shared work and easy silence. They rebuilt the section of fence Croft's men had leaned on, working side by side. He taught her how to sight a straight line. She showed him how to tie a knot that held fast. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating something strong and durable. The house, once hollow and haunted, began to breathe again. It filled with the smell of baking bread that was now light and airy, and the sound of her occasional quiet humming. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, She rested her head against his shoulder. He stiffened for a moment, surprised by the casual intimacy, then relaxed, leaning into her touch. He draped an arm around her, and they sat there as the sky turned from gold to purple, two solitary figures who had found a universe in each other's quiet company. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," she murmured into the rough fabric of his shirt, "or the most foolish." He was silent for a long moment. "Can't I be both?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She smiled. It was a real smile this time, full and bright. She had found her name, and in doing so had helped him find a reason to live again, not just survive. The grave on the hill was no longer a symbol of all he had lost, but a quiet reminder of a love that had made him capable of this new one. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp air of autumn, and then the deep, cleansing cold of winter. They faced it together. The cabin was small, but it was warm. Their life was hard, but it was full. They had taken two broken lives and from the pieces, built a home. The final image isn't one of grand declarations or dramatic passions. It's this: two people on a porch, sitting in comfortable silence as snow begins to fall, blanketing the hard land in a soft, clean white. His arm is around her, her head is on his shoulder. The house behind them is lit from within, a beacon of warmth against the cold. They are not just survivors anymore. They are a family, forged not by blood or law, but by the simple, profound act of choosing to stand together in the dust and face down the world. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's about the quiet truth that sometimes the most profound acts of love aren't spoken in loud words, but in the silent language of shared burdens. It's in a bowl of stew left on a table, a blanket offered against the cold, a stance taken on a dusty patch of land that says, "You are not alone." It's about how a person can be stripped of everything, even their own name, and still find the strength to choose a new one. We all have a version of that dusty town inside us, a place where we feel judged, tied down, and named by our worst moments. We're told we're too much of one thing, not enough of another. But the story of Elias and Lena whispers a different truth into the wind. It says that real strength isn't in the noise you make, but in the quiet resolve to offer kindness without condition. It says that a home isn't four walls, but the safe space you build in another person's heart. So here is your naming. It is not the one given to you by fear or by failure. It is the one you choose when you finally decide to stand up, pick up your iron skillet, and claim your own life. And if you're brave enough to offer a piece of your own hard-won bread,